Hello everyone, my name is Ezekiel Juarez Garcia, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Florida and member of the Human Informatics and Predictive Performance Optimization Laboratory. Today I'll be discussing how to detect high-risk anomalies in aircraft dynamics through the use of entropic methods on time series data. Over the next 15 years, the International Civil Aviation Organization projects a doubling of aircraft traffic. Some of this traffic will be in part to the increased passenger load factor, but more important to our study will be the aircraft traffic produced by the introduction of more unmanned autonomous systems into the national airspace. This push for autonomy comes from projects such as NASA's Advanced Air Mobility Project, as well as the FAA's NextGen project, which seek to have a more connected and denser, urbanized, and rural national airspace. So, in order to develop safety measures to safely accommodate all of these types of aircraft, is going to require different generalizable and interpretable methods to be developed. Currently, safety assurance methods primarily rely on exceeding thresholds, which means that when a signal goes above or below a predefined threshold, then an alert or warning is given to the operator in order to make corrective action. Despite the numerous machine learning approaches that we currently have, they remain mainly good for detecting known anomalies for specific aircraft. So this presents a challenge when moving an anomaly detection model from one aircraft to another. For example, what happens when you go from an Airbus A320 to a Bombardier Challenger 350? Although these are similar aircraft, they have different safety operational bounds, which means that you may have to retrain an entire neural network, for example, in order to translate your anomaly detection model. So, as an alternative to this, we've hypothesized that entropic analysis, which characterizes a system based on its complexity or lack thereof, can provide an alternative solution to anomaly detection. For example, the system on the left has low complexity and high predictability, predictability meaning the inverse of complexity in this case, and the one on the right has high complexity and low predictability. So both of these types of systems, which could represent the output of a sensor or the control input by an operator, stay within the safety bounds shown in red. However, the irregular pattern on the right might be an example of an anomaly that would go undetected by solely using threshold-based methods. Therefore, we wanted to study the link between complexity and anomalies, and we did this by looking at unstable approaches. 7% of approaches are deemed unstable, with only 4% of them resulting in rejected landings. Moreover, 16% of commercial fleet accidents were under the precedence of an unstable approach, according to a study. So hopefully you've never been in an accident that had a wing strike or a tail strike, but there are more serious consequences to an unstable approach, such as a runway excursion or even collision with the environment. The two questions that we proposed were: one, can the addition of entropic methods help in the characterization of flight phases? These flight phases were the climb, cruise, and approach phases. And secondly, how do the entropy dynamics vary between stable and unstable approaches at different time instances before landing? So here we look at predictor variables for unstable approaches. In order to perform our study, we relied on the NASA Dashlink sample flight data. This dataset contains 180,000 regional jet flights, and each flight contains 186 variables, which include aircraft dynamics and other parameters. For each flight, as shown on the right-hand side, we extracted the time series between takeoff and landing, and then we labeled each approach as stable or unstable and the variable that caused the instability. For our entropic analysis, we used two complexity measurements. They were sample entropy and permutation. Both of these complexity measures have been used extensively and with great success in financial and physiological studies. In addition to these two complexity measures, we also ran their multiscalar variant. Multiscalar entropy analysis computes the complexity of a signal by taking non-consecutive samples through the introduction of a downsampling factor. We designed two experiments, each one to address one research question. The first one was characterizing the flight phases between takeoff and landing. For this, we computed two traditional statistical features, mean and standard deviation, and then we added the complexity, and then we used altitude and airspeed deviation for this experiment. We then ran k-means clustering to group the features into states, and then we visualized when the states occurred during a flight. For the second experiment, we wanted to see how the complexity evolved throughout the approach phase. So for this, we created an overlapping and non-overlapping windows, which I'll talk more about later, during the last 8 minutes of flight. We limited our analysis to the last 8 minutes of flight because, on average, we saw that a plane crosses the 1,000 feet threshold at about 2 minutes before landing. The 1,000 feet threshold is important because that's when the determination of unstable approach is made. So therefore, we have 6 minutes of data to look back on to see how the anomaly is evolving. We then ran multi-scale analysis on the predictive variables, which are glide slope deviation, localizer deviation, and airspeed deviation. These three variables have been shown to be top predictors for unstable approaches. And finally, we compared the complexity of stable and unstable approaches using the Wilcoxon rank sum test. In this slide and the following ones, I'm going to highlight some of the results that we obtained in our study. For more detailed discussion and more results, I welcome you to go over to our paper. So here we have the clusters produced using k-means. On the left-hand side, we have altitude. On the right-hand side, we have airspeed deviation. The three complexity measures that we used were mean, standard deviation, and complexity. In this case, we are using sample entropy. On the left-hand side, we have 3 clusters produced for the altitude features. And on the right-hand side, we have 4 clusters produced by the airspeed deviation features. I'd like to highlight that some of the states or clusters that we see here are along the complexity axis, so this would not have been possible had we only looked at mean and standard deviation. More importantly, I'd like to draw your attention to the outliers. So the outliers for altitude on the left-hand side occur when the plane switches from a low magnitude of rate of change to a high magnitude of rate of change. So the complexity from this basically change in the derivative is manifested in these outliers. So you can see that they have high complexity, and also the mean tends to vary widely between 0 and about 10 or 15. Now, on the right-hand side for airspeed deviation, we note that the outlier group was enough to warrant a new cluster being created. In our study, we use the Davies-Boulding index as the metric for our clustering algorithm, and different algorithms will come up with a different number of clusters. However, the placement of the clusters will still be the same, and in this case, 4 clusters made it so this outlier group had its own cluster. To visualize when these states occur throughout a flight, here we have plotted the altitude plots of 3 different flights that were not part of our k-means clustering. You can see how the red state, state number 3, tends to mainly group at the beginning of the flight during the climb phase. The yellow state tends to mainly group at the middle of the flight where the altitude is nearly constant. And the blue state, state number 2, tends to cluster near areas where the plane is descending. That can be mainly seen at the end of the flight during the approach phase. So the main takeaway with this is that yes, we can use entropic methods in addition to traditional statistical features to characterize the flight phases, at least by looking at altitude. We do note that the results for airspeed deviation were a bit more inconclusive. However, they still bring some insight into how these features are evolving throughout a flight. Moving on to research question number 2, here we have visualized the multi-scale entropy results on glide slope deviation using overlapping time windows. The goal with using overlapping time windows is to see whether the complexity during the last 2 minutes of flight, so from 2 minutes to landing, whether that dominates the complexity at larger time windows from 4 minutes to landing, 6 to landing, and 8 to landing. Here we have complexity on the y-axis. Again, we were looking at sample entropy, and temporal scale on the x-axis. In the dash, we have the mean of unstable approaches, and then in solid, we have the mean of stable approaches. And the error bars are the standard error. And we can see from the very beginning, from temporal scale 1, that the distributions on stable and unstable approaches are significantly different. And this mean, it grows as the temporal scale increases as well as diverges. So we can see that that complexity is manifested at multiple time scales, not just a single one. For non-overlapping time windows, the goal is to see how complexity evolves across 2-minute windows starting from 8 minutes before landing. And we can see that across the temporal scales that we analyze, there are significant differences between the distributions of unstable and stable approaches. And those distributions that are not significant, for example, 6 minutes to 4 minutes before landing, shown in purple, do become significantly different at the temporal scale number 3. So supporting our analysis for using multi-scale entropy. So this is important because we've shown that there are significant complexity distributions at the time windows where the plane hasn't crossed that 1,000 feet threshold, which is used in the determination of an unstable approach. To summarize our findings, we provided an alternative approach to analyze anomalies that does not rely on thresholds and is still interpretable. This approach looks at the irregularity of predictability embedded within a sensor output signal or control input signal by an operator or pilot, and to determine the presence of an anomaly. With the distributions that we have of unstable and stable approaches, we hope to be able to use sensor fusion in the future to predict approaches ahead of time, given more time for pilots or even autonomous systems to make a corrective action and avoid an accident. With that, we'd like to thank you for viewing our presentation and hope you enjoyed the rest of the conference, and we'll take any of your questions.